We're going to be doing applique this month, and the method that the pattern has it is template applique. So I'm going to show you how the pattern says to make the templates, and then I'm going to show you how I usually make my templates. So to make the templates the way the pattern says, you're going to need freezer paper, and you're going to need like a cereal box or a cracker box. This is the pattern for the Joseph's Coat block, and the pattern says to make these petals just a little bit smaller than what they are on the pattern. We can play with that as we go. So I'm going to get a piece of freezer paper, and I drew a straight line through it, and then you're going to just put it over your pattern, and you're going to trace your shape. Now, I don't know about you, but I cannot trace smooth curves, so I would recommend something that is a similar size that has the circle shape, and set it down and trace around that. So this is just a saucer. Once I have my pattern traced, and I only need one of these because they're all exactly the same on this pattern, I'm going to just rough cut it. Doesn't have to be pretty at this point. And then I'm going to press it to the cardboard side of a piece of my box. And you don't have to press it on real hard, you just want to press it on enough that it sticks. Because in the pattern she has you take these off and use them for a pattern, so you want to be able to peel it off. And now I need to cut this out as smoothly as I can, and I would recommend not using your fabric scissors. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this out off camera. So there's my template. At this point, if you want to do it the way the pattern says, we can peel the freezer paper off and then use it for the pattern on our fabric. But you can also just trace around the template. Another option for your template, and the one that I use most often, is to use heat-resistant Templar plastic. And the template plastic has a dull side and a shiny side. So you're going to trace on the dull side, so I traced just like if I had been doing it on anything else. And again, I want to cut it out as smoothly as I possibly can. The reason you want it smooth is because if you have bumps and lumps in your template, you're going to end up with them in your applique as well. These are my templates. It can be either one, and you only need one. The cardboard will wear down over time. If you got little bumps that you need to take out of your template that you're not getting with scissors, you can either use a nail file or a fine grit sandpaper. The fabrics in your kit for the Joseph's Coat block are the largest white square, and then you have 4 smaller rectangles of print fabric. We are going to cut our white square down to an accurate 7-inch square. That is still going to be oversized, but since we're doing this where the petals are going into the center of our block, it's going to be important that the piece we're working on is square. So I could walk around, but I'm being lazy. I clean cut my 2 edges. Now I'm going to line up my 7-inch mark on the 2 edges that I just cut and finish cutting down to 7 inches. Now it's going to be important that our petals are centered on here, so go ahead and fold your block, your background block, in half on the diagonal. I'm just going to finger press a crease in there. And then I'm going to open it up and fold it the other way on the diagonal as well, and finger press. Now, on the wrong side of your smaller rectangles, we're going to take our template and put it down on there. We want to make sure we leave about 1/4 inch all the way around. You can play with it a little bit. And if you want to turn it a little bit so that it's kind of on the diagonal, that will put your curves on the bias a little bit, so it might be easier to turn. When you're happy with where it is, I'm just using a mechanical pencil and I'm tracing around my shape. And then I'm just going to cut it out, leaving about 1/4 inch. The more you applique, probably the less that's going to be, but about 1/4 all the way around it. And You may have noticed when I started, I do cut straight across my points and don't leave a whole quarter there because I'm taking some of the bulk out ahead of time. So I'm going to do that for all 4 of my print rectangles. So now you can use either Best Press or I'm using sizing. Whichever you're using, you're going to spray a little bit of it into a container. With the sizing, I can just spray a little on the cap. And then you're going to need a paintbrush. Any paintbrush will work, a small one. Even the one in the children's watercolor sets will work just fine. And whichever template you're using, it's going to go on the wrong side of your fabric. If you're using the cardboard one, then you want the print side to be up because it will take the starch a little better. I'm going to go ahead and use my Templar one. On the cardboard ones, you'll probably be able to use those templates 3 or 4 times, but they will start to wear down because of the wet starch on here. So I'm just painting starch or Best Press or sizing on the seam allowance of my fabric that's extending beyond my template. I want to get it nice and wet. Alright, so now I'm just going to press those seam allowances over my template. Now this is heat resistant plastic. Make sure you're using Templar, not just regular template plastic. You can use any iron you want. I just like this little clover iron for doing this. And if I have points like this, I usually like to start by pressing those points flat down. And you want your iron hot enough that it's going to dry your liquid that you put on the edges, but not so hot that it is warping your template plastic. So you will probably have to hold it for a few seconds to get it to dry. Now I'm just going to start working my way around the applique. And this does take some practice. I'm just using the edge of my iron to turn it up and over the edge of my template. So don't try to go too fast. It's just slow and steady because we want to get nice smooth edges on this. But I'm trying to press until my fabric is dry. I can come back and do it again. So I'm going all the way down to my edge. And if it's not going as easy as it looks like it's going for me, just realize I've demoed this lots of times. Just take it easy. Just take your time. Because as smooth as you get it now is the smoothest you can get it on your fabric, on your background. And burning yourself is a real possibility with this method. There are guards that you can put on your fingers, but I have demoed those before, and what I tend to do is move the finger that has the guard out of the way. So you could also use like a skewer or a toothpick to hold things down if you feel like you need to. So once I've gone all the way around on this edge, I'm going to flip it over and just make sure that it's dry on the other side. And once I've done that, and it's dry, it's a good idea to let it cool first. Then I can just pop my template out, and this is ready to stitch down, and my template is ready to use again. So I will press all 4 of my petals, just like this. So once all my petal shapes are pressed, I need to decide how they're going to be on the block. I'm not pinning them all on at once, but I like that arrangement. So I want to make sure that my one tip is clear down here in the center because I want to make sure that there's at least a ½ inch out beyond the edges here because we're going to trim this down to 6½ inches later. So I don't want to be trimming off the edge of my applique, nor do I want to be sewing through it when I put the block together. I'm going to pin my pieces on with applique pins. Applique pins are shorter so that your thread doesn't get tangled around it while you're stitching. So I'm going to put, and I always put more than one. In this case, definitely more than one, but even if it's a teeny tiny piece, I want more than one because it will rotate or twist when I only have one. So I have my point on my crease here, and I want my point on the crease down on this end. And I'm going to put a couple more pins in just to hold it right where I want it. So now I'm ready to sew. When I'm appliquing, I want to use at least a 60 weight thread. I know that the pattern says a 50 weight, but the finer your thread, the more invisible your stitches. So this is a 60 weight. We also have some 80 weight in the store. There's a 100 weight. That one's a polyester, but it's really easy to thread your needle and it does disappear. So depends on whether you're a purist or not. And for needles, I like a size 11 straw needle. If you feel like the 11 bends too much for you, then you can go to a 10. Remember, on hand needles, the higher the number, the finer the needle, and it does have a small eye. All right, I've threaded my needle, and I did that off camera, although it did thread easy this time. It does have a really small eye, so you might need a needle threader. I like to start with a quilter's knot, and if you've never seen one of those before, I have my needle. I'm going to place the tip of the tail of the thread over the needle, and I'm holding the tail on there. I'm not wrapping the tail side. I'm wrapping the side coming off the tail that runs up to the needle. And I'm going to wrap it around the needle 3 or 4 times. So I have wraps on my needle. I'm going to hold on to that, push my needle through, and pull all the way down so that I have a nice neat knot at the end. You don't have to do that, but that's just my preferred method. Now, to sew this, I don't want to start in a point. I usually in applique will start in my straightest spot, and there isn't really a straight spot on this, so I'm bringing my needle into the crease from the wrong side, so my knot is going to be between my background fabric and my applique fabric. So I came up in the crease. I'm going to go down straight off the edge of my applique fabric into the background, and I may even tuck it slightly under the applique fabric. I'm going to rock my needle and come up a little bit further along. I'm coming up right in the fold of the applique fabric, just catching a couple of threads. Pull through, and I want to tug tight enough that my thread sinks into the fabric, but not so tight that it distorts it. Again, I'm going to go straight off the edge, so perpendicular from where I came up, straight off the edge of the applique into the background fabric, really close to the edge of the applique fabric, or even slightly, and I do mean slightly, under it. Rock my needle, again, come up in the applique fabric, pull up my stitch, and I'm going to just keep doing that all the way around. I'll come back to the video when I'm doing the corner, but with Starch Press, it's really not that big a deal. We're not having to turn it when we get there. When I get up to the corner, like I said, it's not as big a deal with Starch Press, but I want to make sure that I put a stitch right on the edge of the corner, and then I'm also going to put one right into the tip of the corner. And then right on the edge on the other side. So when you're doing applique, the sharper the points, the tighter the curves, the closer together you need your stitches to be. So now I'll just keep stitching around until I finish. Then I'll take my thread to the back and knot off on the back, and I will just keep adding the 4 until I have all 4 petals, and then I'll come back and show you the finished block. Here's my finished Joseph's coat block. It does still need to be trimmed down to 6.5 inches, but I'm going to wait to do that until later since it gets displayed and can ravel. This is what's in the kit for the redwork Pear. You have options on this block, but first let's talk about what's in the kit. You have a square piece of fabric. You actually have 2 square white pieces that are this size. One's going to be for the cherry block and one's for the pear block. You have a green square. It is not a print, it's a solid. And then the pattern says you have a yellow square. This is taking the place of the yellow square that's on the pattern. And then I've added another piece of fabric, this yellow piece. The yellow piece is if you choose to applique your pear. If you choose not to applique your pear, then you could certainly use it instead of this one for our yo-yo. So your options on this block are to either do red work, so you would be embroidering the outline of the pear, or you can applique. The directions are written for red work. However, I have seen a picture of the finished quilt, and the finished quilt was appliqued. So I'm appliquing my pear. That's optional. If you choose to applique it, you're going to do templates just like what you did for the Joseph's coat, and then starch and press it down. I did need to take some clips in my seam allowance on this curve since it's an inside curve. You don't want to go all the way to the edge, but enough that the fabric releases and will do a smooth curve. The pattern is calling this block a red work pear. However, just because it says it's red work does not mean that your floss has to be red. That's completely up to you. The pattern's written and it says to do a stem stitch with 2 strands of embroidery floss. You could also do a back stitch if you want to. I'm going to put links to tutorials for both of those stitches and probably the chain stitch also. I'm not going to record it again in this video. So if you're doing the red work, you need to mark your design on your fabric. And what I'm going to show you has absolutely nothing to do with this quilt. It's just something that I've marked. So this is a block that I have marked for something else. And you'll notice that I just have the outlines where I'm going to embroider. I actually did mark how big my block is going to be when I cut it out, just because I'm embroidering a whole bunch of them on a piece of fabric before I cut it out. So to mark it, you have choices. A lot of times patterns will tell you to use a micron Pigma pen, which is a permanent marking pen. And you can certainly do that. That's one option. I like the Frixion pen, which will remove with heat, and you could also just use a pencil. So there's pros and cons of all of those. With the pencil, sometimes when you're working, you will smear your pencil lines. With the permanent pen, it is permanent, and that can be a drawback if you aren't tracing very carefully and you get marks where you do not intend to embroider. With the Frixion pen, you cannot press your block until you're completely done because your marks will disappear. The other thing I want to warn you about on the Frixion pen is you can use heat to remove it. So once you're finished, if you just hold an iron over it or press your block, the marks will disappear. However, if you get your work below 14 degrees, the marks will come back. Now for me, that's not a big deal when I'm embroidering because I'm covering most of them. So it's completely up to you. So you will just take your pattern and you can put it on a window, tape it on a window. You can probably see through it without doing that. You could use your light in your oven and tape it on that window if you're not working on it during the day. If you have a light box, that works great. And you'll trace the outline of the pear. So that would be the solid lines on here. The dotted lines are going to be something else. So go ahead and do that if you're doing the red work, and then I'm going to show you how to make the leaf and the yo-yo, which will be the same whether you're doing applique or red work. From our green square, we need to cut a 3.5 inch circle. So you can either use a compass and just draw the circle on here. If you had something that has a circle that was 3.5 inches, you could use that. I thought I'd show you a circle cutter today. So this has a rotary cutter blade in it, and you can set it just like you can a compass. And since we're setting this for a 3.5 inch circle, it would be 1 3/4 between the blade and the point, or the same thing in the compass, it's 1 3/4 between. So with the circle cutter, I'm going to just put my point down in the center, and I want to check it to make sure I'm going to get it all the way around. I'm not putting any pressure on it right now. Come up just a hair. Okay, once I'm happy with it, I just press down, and there's a rotary cutter blade in there, so I can just cut my circle. Okay, I'm not real good here on camera, but it will just cut out the circle for you instead of marking it. It doesn't matter how you got your circle. Once you have your circle out of the green, we're going to just fold it in half and cut on the fold. So we have just a half a circle. And you're only going to use one of those, not both. So then we're going to fold it in half again and match that straight edge. And you can put a couple pins in it. And we are going to stitch with a 1/4 inch seam allowance along the straight edge. There's my stitched half circle, and then we're going to turn it right side out. So it's kind of like making a strawberry for a pin cushion, and you want the point to come out on this. I'm using just a mechanical pencil that the lead's not extended to push that out. I don't want to poke a hole through it. So there's that, and then we're going to finger press the seam, and it's going to be in the back of our cone shape. And then we are going to do a running stitch along the raw edge, and mine's kind of sticking out here. I'm going to do a running stitch around the short edge, and then I'll trim off any extra there on the that's sticking out on the other side. So it's running stitches just in and out, or basting stitch, whatever you want to. And if you are appliquing, I'm going to hide the edges of this under my applique. If you are doing red work, then you're going to be hiding the raw edges under a yo-yo. And I know there are some of you that don't like a yo-yo, but you would have to do something to hide the raw edges. Either that, or you could just stitch out your leaves. You wouldn't have to have them dimensional. I'm going to go ahead and cut off my extra here. And then I'm going to just pull this up so that we get a leaf shape like that, and I'll tie a knot in it. I knotted this off. I have not cut the thread yet. So I appliqued my pear down already, but I just left a little bit up here. So I'm going to just slide the edge of my leaf under there, and you can play with it, and then tack it down with a couple basting stitches. So wrong needle. Okay. Just a couple stitches just to hold it there. And I'll do a couple more off camera. And then I'll finish stitching my pear down. You may notice I don't have the stem yet for my pear. I will be embroidering that. And I think I will use a chain stitch, so I'll come back once I have that applique down, and I'm going to go ahead and embroider my chain stitch on there as well. I forgot to mention, my personal preference for embroidery is to use a hoop. There are some people that do not like to use a hoop, and if you're not using a hoop, then you're probably going to want to put a stabilizer behind this, and probably just a iron-on interfacing would work well. Some people that hoop still back with interfacing so their jump stitches don't show. I don't. I'd like as little fabric there as possible because I get smaller stitches that way. So completely up to you, personal preference. For the red work, the pattern is saying 2 strands of floss and a stem stitch. So I wanted to show you some options. I don't actually have one, this 2 strands of floss and a stem stitch handy, but this one is a stem stitch and 3 strands of floss. This one is a back stitch with 2 strands of floss. And then this one, the cherry part, is a back stitch, and I'm using size 8 pearl cotton in there. So you don't have to do what the pattern says. You can choose the look you want. So here's my pear block. I finished appliquing it down, and I ended up using an open chain stitch with a size 8 pearl cotton for the stem. I will post a link for that stitch. So now we're going to make a blossom to go right there over the top edge of that leaf, and that's going to be especially important if you are doing red work instead of applique. But even if you did applique, there's a bit of a bump there. So we're going to use yo-yo makers, or I'm going to for this demo. I do have a video that I did last year showing how to make yo-yos without the yo-yo maker, so I will post a link to that as well. So yo-yo maker is in 2 parts. It's got the kind of cup plate side, and then it's got the part that snaps into it. So I'm going to put my fabric right side down into the cup. So it should, the right side should be showing through the hole on this side. And then you'll notice there are little notches here. There are also lines here that are going to match up with those notches. So this goes in here. I'm going to line up that notch and just snap that in there. And then we are going to cut off our extra fabric. And I usually just put my scissors up against the edge of the yo-yo maker, and that's about how much extra fabric I need sticking out. So just all the way around. So now we need to stitch down our edges. You're going to want to double your thread, and it's nice if you have a little bit heavier weight thread. I'm using a quilting thread, and I like to start next to one of these bumps to kind of keep track of where I am. We're going to start by going down, and I'm holding this over so it's folded through one of our spots, and we're actually coming out here on the back. See how there are slots here? So we want to make sure that our stitches are in those slots. So I came through here, I'm going to go back through on this side, and I don't usually flip them back and forth to see it. You can feel it. And then I'll go down in the next hole, and then back up, and I'm just flipping it so you can see. And I'm going to stitch all the way around this. So I'll come back after I've done that. I've stitched all the way around, and when I get back to where I started, I usually take one more stitch over my first one. It just keeps it from having a gap. Once I have that stitched all the way around, then I'm going to pop the center out. I'm going to open this up enough that I can get this disc out. Okay, so now I'm just going to pull up my running stitches, which is what I was doing through that disc. And the smaller the yo-yo is, the more you have to fuss with it to get it to look good. I'm going to pull it all the way up. And I want my gathers in the center of the yo-yo so I can adjust that. And then I'm going to take my needle through to the back, and you can knot it off there on the back. So I knotted it off on the back. And at this point you could switch thread colors if you want to. It is going to show. We're going to make this yo-yo into more of a flower shape. So we're going to come back up through the center. And then we're going to take our thread over the edge of the yo-yo and then back up through the center again so that we've actually wrapped the thread around the edge. And we're going to pull that up tight so that it makes a dent in our yo-yo. Okay. So we're going to make petals by doing this. So then this is the beginning of 2 petals. We're making 3 petals total. So if you want them to be even, then you need to kind of divide up what's left out here so that you're dividing your circle into thirds. So I'm going to come back up through the bottom. Again, I've wrapped it over the edge of my yo-yo. There, and then once more I'm going to go around it. So I'm splitting up the last big section of my yo-yo. Pull it through. So mine's a little bit lopsided, but you can see that there's 3 buds on it. I'll take my thread back through the back and then knot off. So I went back and fussed with my blossom a little bit. So now all I have to do is tack it down on top of my pear and my leaf. So especially if you're doing red work, you want to make sure you're covering up the raw edges of your leaf. So you can position that how you like, and you're just going to take a couple stitches through it and knot it off on the back. And that will finish off your pear block. I messed up a little bit on the pear block. It would be best to trim your block down to 6.5 after you have either embroidered your pear in your stem or appliqued and embroidered your stem. It's going to be kind of a pain in the neck to get a nice 6.5 inch with my dimensional stuff on here. I think I can pull it off, but I don't want you to have to do it. Our next block is the redwork cherry, and once again you have options. You have the other white background square that was the same size as the one we did the pear on, and then you have the pattern says you have a red square. Mine's the end of what I was cutting. I've also added in some green. If you want to applique your leaves, you can. If you would rather just stitch them out, that's fine as well. I'm going to applique my leaves, and we're going to do yo-yo cherries. If you don't like yo-yos, and I know there are a few of you that don't, you could just make circles and applique them in their place. I've appliqued my leaves, and I stitched my stems with a number 8 pearl cotton and a chain stitch. The pattern says to stem stitch all of this, so that's certainly an option. One of the things I want you to get out of this month is that, especially with applique and embroidery, just because the pattern says one thing doesn't mean you have to do that. Make it your own. If you have some other thing you would rather do that. It's a little bit more forgiving than piece blocks. So this is the point where I should be trimming this down to 6.5 inches. I've pressed this, and when we're pressing applique and embroidery, you want to press from the wrong side, and it's not a bad idea to do it on top of a terry cloth towel. So now I need to trim this down to 6.5 inches, and I checked the pattern, and the edge of this leaf is about 1.25 in, and the top of this leaf is at about 1 inch. I just want it centered, so I'm gonna go about 1.25 in. And if you wanted to, you could cut out a piece of freezer paper that was 6.5 inches and iron that onto here so that you could see exactly what your center is. I'm gonna live dangerously. So I've trimmed those two sides, and now I'm going to finish trimming this down to 6.5 inches. The yo-yos for the cherries are made exactly the same way as we did the initial yo-yo for the blossom on the pear. We're just not making it into a blossom. The only difference is for the pear blossom we used the size small yo-yo maker, and for the cherry we're going to use a large. Now do remember, you need to get 2 of these out of your piece of red, but other than that it's exactly the same way as we did the yo-yo for the pear. So I'm not going to show it again. I've finished my yo-yos, and now you just need to place them onto your block. You could just tack them if you wanted to. The pattern does say to applique them down, and that is what I'm going to do. And there's my finished cherry block. I did stitch down my yo-yos so they do not flop, but again, you could tack them. They could be loose on there. So if you absolutely do not want to do your red work by hand, or your hands just don't work like they once did, I'm going to show you a way that you can do it on the sewing machine that will emulate the look of a hand back stitch. I starched and best pressed or sizing my fabric, and I did press it dry. I traced my design with a Frixion pen onto my fabric. You are going to want a stabilizer when you're doing this on the machine. So I have my machine set for a triple stitch. That is number 3 on my sapphire, and I have a 12 weight thread in the top, which means I need a bigger needle, so I am using a size 90 embroidery needle. I have regular thread in the bobbin. I have an open toe foot on the machine. So I am going to start by bringing my thread to the top. I don't really have to do that, but I like to know where it's going to be and it's not wadding up on the bottom. So to do that, I take a stitch, pull up my bobbin thread, and then I'll put it under my foot. My stitch length is set at a 3. So with the triple stitch, it's taking 1 stitch forward and 1 stitch back for each stitch. So anytime I'm going to pivot, I need to do it on the last stitch that came forward, or I will have a gap. And I am sitting off center from the camera, which makes it, I mean not from the camera, off center from the sewing machine, which makes it a little bit hard to stay on the lines. So if this is heavier than what you want, you could use a 30 weight thread. If you don't have a triple stitch on your sewing machine, you could just use your straight stitch, and then I would definitely use the heavier thread. So I'm going to go ahead and sew around this, and then I will come back and show it to you and as I'm finishing. So I'm coming up to my last stitch, and if it looks like it's going to be off, you could always adjust the length of your stitch at this point. I think I'm going to be okay. So that's my last stitch. I'll bring my needle up. And I'm going to pull this out and leave a long tail. And then I will cut it off, and of course I don't have any scissors sitting here. Okay, I got my scissors. So I'm going to cut it off, leave a long tail, and then what I will do is I will thread a needle and I will take it to the back by hand and tie a knot. But I wanted you to see that it really does simulate a hand back stitch. So that's an option for you. For the Rolling Stones block, we have just 2 pieces of fabric in the kit. We have a white rectangle and a red rectangle. And I did spray starch these, or best press, or sizing, whatever you want, and press them dry. From my white rectangle, I need 1 long strip that's 1.5 by at least 11 inches, and 4 1 7/8 inch squares, or you can use your squared ruler and cut the center for 2-inch finished square in the square units. So the first thing I'm going to do, I have mine folded in half at the moment, is straighten one edge, and I'm going to cut off that 1.5 inch strip. And I am going to have to move it because of what I have sitting in the way. So I'm just going to line up my long line on the 1.5, and I didn't square up the short edges on this. And I'm not going to worry about cutting it down. Now your white strip may not be the same size as mine because I was using up leftovers rather than cutting additional strips. So you can either cut your piece for your 1 7/8 inch squares with the ruler at 1 7/8. But as I've told you before, when you're doing a square in a square unit, it's not usually an exact measurement. I'm going to use the squared ruler, and I will be using the marking here that's for the center square on a 2-inch finished square in a square unit, and it is not 1 7/8. The measurement is off between a 7/8 mark and a hole mark, so I'm going to use that. But I am cutting 4 of these. So what I'm going to do, I've straightened the edge of this fabric, is put the line for my 2-inch finish, and I'm going to put a ruler up against it. I'm going to slide it along on my edge to make sure it's the same width all the way down. And when I'm satisfied with it, I'm going to move the square in a square ruler away, and then I'm going to cut this strip. Then once I've cut the strip, then I will just go ahead and cut squares off using my squared ruler. And I need 4 of those. But you can do the 1 7/8 if you do not have the squared ruler or do not want to invest in it. It's just more accurate. But it's unlikely this is going to be a show quilt, so whatever you're happy with. so that piece is scrap. From my red rectangle, I also need a strip that is 1.5 by at least 11 inches. I'm going to clean cut one edge. I'm going to walk around. Oops. And put my 1.5 inch mark on that edge that I just cleaned up. And again, I'm not going to worry about cutting that strip down. It doesn't matter if it's oversized. Now from the red, I do need one 2.5 inch square, and then I need 8 2.25 inch squares. I'm going to cut one strip off 2.5, and then I'll cut it down smaller after I cut my 2.5 inch square off of it. That over. And then my other strip is going to be 2.25, and I do have this folded in half. You don't have to if you're using a longer ruler and a bigger cutting mat. I'm going to have to open this one up, and I'm going to straighten one short edge and cut off my 2.5 inch square. Move it down so it's more in your line of sight. So any line along my long edge and the 2.5 inch mark along my short edge. And now I'm going to cut this strip down to 2.25. So since this edge is straight, I can line up lines with my short edge down here. Okay, 2.25 times 4 would be 9 inches, and I do have 9 inches here, so I'm going to go ahead and do the 9. Let me move this so you're seeing my measurements down here better. So any line along my long edges to keep it straight, cut off that end. I'm backing my ruler up 2.25, so I'm going to 6 3/4. My mark down here, and again I'm keeping long lines on the straight edge. That's right. And then I'm going back to 4.5. And to 2.25. And I'm going to do the same thing on my other strip. I'm going to cut 4 more squares. Each one of these squares is cut in half on the diagonal once. So I have a 45-degree line here on one edge, and I'm just putting my ruler point to point and cutting. So I will do that to all 8 of the 2.25 inch squares, so that I end up with 16 triangles. We are going to sew our 1.5 inch red strip to our 1.5 inch white strip along the long edge, and they're not going to be the same length if you didn't trim them down, which is just fine, because we will be trimming after they're sewn together. Once you have sewn it together, we're going to press the seam open. Alright, I did press my seam open just like I said. So this strip should now be 2.5 inches wide. And we are going to cut 4 2.5 inch squares out of it. So we need to clean up one edge, and when I'm cutting from a strip, I like to have a line running down my seam. That helps keep everything straight. I'm going to cut, and I could walk around, but I have my camera plugged in, so I don't want to trip. Alright, so 2.5 times 4 is 10 inches. So I'm going to put my 10 inch mark on my short edge that I straightened. I'm running a line down my seam, and if it really is 2.5 inches, you should also have lines running down both of your long edges. So when I have the 10 inch lined up, I'm going to cut. That piece is scrap. I didn't get very straight there. There we go. I'm going to back up to 7.5. And cut. back up to 5, and cut, and then to 2.5 and cut. And that gives me 4 red and white squares. So now I'm ready to make my square and a square units, and I'm going to make all 4 of them the same way. My white 1 7/8 inch square, or the square you cut with your square squared ruler, is going to be the center. And my triangles are oversized. I'm putting them on opposite sides. When I'm sewing with the white on top because that is my most accurate measurement. My triangles are oversized, so I want to make sure I'm getting 1/4 inch away from the edge of the square. So I'm going to do all 4 of these at one time. I'm going to sew triangles to the opposite sides of my white squares. I've sewn my opposite sides onto my white square, and I pressed out toward the triangles, away from the center. Square and squares any I have ever seen have always been pressed away from the center. So now I'm just going to add triangles to the remaining 2 sides. And I'm not sure that I said this earlier, but I'm just visually centering my square on my triangles. The triangles are oversized, so as long as it looks like it's centered, that's good enough. So again, I'm going to sew with the white square on top. And I just sew those triangles to the remaining 2 sides of my white square. I added my last 2 triangles, and again I pressed away from the center. So now these need to be trimmed down. If you are not using the square squared ruler, then I would recommend a square ruler. So we're trimming them down to 2.5 inches. So half of 2.5 is 1 1/4. So I am putting my 1 1/4 mark on my point. So the 1 1/4 line running through here and through here. And then I'm also putting my 1/4 inch mark on the point as close as I can get it, okay? And I'm going to trim 2 sides, then rotate my block, and once I've trimmed 2 sides, I've committed. So now I'm just putting my 2.5 inch line on those 2 edges that I just cut, and cut the remaining 2 sides. Okay, so that's without the square squared ruler. If you have the square squared ruler, down on the opposite end from where our centers are, there's the trimming section. So for that, we're going to be trimming to the 2.5. So I'm going to put those little crosshairs that say 2, because this is going to be a finished 2-inch block, on my corners, and then I'm going to trim 2 sides again, just like on the square ruler, rotate, and again I've kind of committed, so it's my 2.5 mark here, but really it should still have my 2-inch crosshairs on the corners. So whichever method you're using, you're going to trim down all 4 square and square units. Once I've trimmed down my square and a square blocks, now I'm just going to sew all my units together into a 9 patch. So I would sew this row, then this row, then this row. I will press, I'm going to press in toward the center on the top and bottom rows, and out away from the center on that row, on the middle row. My rows are sewn together, and now I'm just going to sew those together, and my matching spots are here and actually here. So I will make sure that this is lining up with this, and then just sew the rows together. Here's my finished rolling stones block. After I sewed my rows together, I did press in toward the center of the block. So we have a total of 4 blocks this month, and I didn't say it earlier, but you do not have to applique by hand if you don't want to. You can do machine applique with a raw edge fusible, and I will provide a link to a video I've done on that previously. Also, your red work can be either by hand or by machine. You can choose your stitches. This month I just want you to think about the fact that you can be creative and make these blocks your own. They don't have to be done the way the pattern says.